Hello, everyone. We are now beginning the last webinar for the Syrian Revolution, A History from Below. My name is Yazan Al-Saadi. I am one of the organizers and people that volunteered behind the scenes to set up these series of webinars since June 20th. And the idea is that this online summer institute titled The Syrian Revolution, A History from Below, was a series of webinars about grassroots politics, class struggles, and state violence in Syria since the 1970s up until the present. The multi-part series had covered a lot of topics, and it was organized by a large number of people, from activists, organizers, academics, and writers. And the topics had ranged from feminist struggles to international solidarity, political economy, the prison system, healthcare under war, Palestinian solidarity, Kurdish self-determination, and so many other topics that relate to Syria. Why did we do these webinars? Well, as you probably know, the audience, Syria is a very contentious topic. Since the uprising began in 2011, hegemonic narratives have dominated the conversation on Syria, regardless of the political spectrum, whether on the left or right. These hegemonic narratives have been immensely harmful for the Syrian population, regardless of where one stands. Therefore, myself and many other people volunteered to try and organize a series of conversations of a wide range of people, Syrian or otherwise, to really have a critical reflection about the Syrian uprising, its legacy, what happened, why did it happen, and what's next. And it was an absolute honor and privilege to be involved with such a great number of people and speakers. These series of events, like I mentioned earlier, had begun since June 20th, has been warmly sponsored by organizations like Haymarket Books, Pluto Press, the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists, Warscapes, Solidarity, Emergency Committee for Rojava, as well as the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. And we would like to thank each and every one of them for their support on these webinars. Today is our final webinar on the Syrian Revolution, looking at what's next. The hope of this webinar is to explore the grassroots struggles, the creative resistance, and the pitfalls of what happened to the Syrian Revolution. The remarkable panelists of today will try to inform you as best as they can, looking at the geography of resistance that happened on the ground, and talk about what can be done next with all the challenges that are facing the Syrian population and their allies. This last webinar is sponsored by SOAS Syria Society, Solidarity, Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists, New Politics, and the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. It is my absolute pleasure at the moment to introduce the moderator and discussant, Wendy Pearlman. She's a professor and award-winning teacher at Northwestern University, specializing in Middle East politics. She's been educated at Harvard, Georgetown, and Brown, and Pearlman had spent more than 20 years in our region, working and living in the Arab world. She's an author of numerous articles and 4 books, most notably the most recent one called We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. I would like to welcome Wendy. She will be your chair and discussant who will introduce the rest of the speakers. Thank you very much to everyone. And thank you, Wendy. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Yazan, and for introducing the entire project of this really terrific series of webinars. Today we have a great conversation planned. We're going to keep it informal. We have a series of questions and we'll open it up for conversation with all 3 of our fantastic panelists. For those of you at home, feel free to write comments or questions in the comment section at any time, and then we will open it up for Q&A, taking questions that you've put forth after about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes of conversation. So with no further ado, let me introduce our three panelists. And we're keeping the bios pretty short today just to have the maximum time for conversation. Marcelle Shehwaro is an activist and writer from Aleppo. She was the co-founder and CEO of the civil society organization Kesh Malek and is an award-winning writer of creative nonfiction. Karam Nachar is a Syrian writer and academic. He is co-founder and co-editor of Al Jamhuriya media platform and a lecturer in modern Middle East history at Essex University in Istanbul. And finally, Ziad Majed is associate professor of international and comparative politics at the American University of Paris. He's the author of 2 books on Syria, Syria, the Orphaned Revolution, and Inside the Mind of Bashar al-Assad. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question for our panelists is, what does revolution mean today? What are the new domains, issues, or forums in which the revolution continues, whether inside or outside Syria? And here, if you'd like, please also feel free to tell us about your own experiences as activists or in the organizations and networks in which you work. So whether from an analytical perspective or a personal perspective, what does revolution mean today? So let's open it up. Anyone want to jump in? Karam, how about you? Any ideas? What does revolution mean today?
Good evening, Wendy. It's 9 o'clock in Istanbul, so I should say good evening, but I don't know, it's probably morning in Chicago. So good morning to you and to everybody in the panel, and to Ziad and Marcell, and also the organizers. I'm very honored to be here. I actually have to start answering this question with a confession. This is actually probably one of the first times I come back to talk about the Syrian Revolution since probably the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017. So basically, more or less since the end of the Battle of Aleppo. And one of the reasons why I've been so apprehensive or reluctant to come on panels and talk about the Syrian Revolution was because there was this distinct feeling that I had, and that I know back then and until now makes a lot of people quite uncomfortable, is that for me, I think there's this desire to keep seeing the Syrian Revolution somewhere. There's this search for the Syrian Revolution, or this insistence on the Syrian Revolution to continue. Whereas in fact, I think quite honestly, that just as back in 2011 and 2012, we argued forcefully and I think quite persuasively that what was happening in Syria was a revolution, not just a protest movement, for multiple reasons. I mean, first, because socially or sociologically, because of the depth of social mobilization that was happening in the country, or historically, because there was the sense that the revolution was this radical sort of shift or rupture in modern Syrian history, both objectively in terms of the events that were transpiring in the country, but also subjectively in the sense of how the Syrians that were partaking in the revolution felt that they were sort of writing a new chapter in history, and also normatively in the sense that everyone, or a lot of people who participated in the revolution back in 2011 and 2012, even though that back then there was still, there was already actually there was a pluralism and multiplicity, and there was a different or divergent understanding of what the revolution means and entails. There was still the sense that the revolution has this sort of universal normative aspiration that puts it in comparison with, the global or universal revolutionary tradition from the American and the French revolutions all the way to the early 1990s democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe. I feel now, and I say this not in the vein of being this sort of didactic or smug realism, or in the vein of being sort of a sense of being tragically lament or being nostalgic. I really think that we need to assert today that the Syrian Revolution, as a political event that actually happened in history, the Syrian Revolution has ended, both in terms of the, and again, I say this as in the vein of being faithful to the values of the Syrian Revolution, or the values that I understand that the Syrian Revolution has embodied. Both organizationally, I think we need to understand that now we're functioning in a completely different moment where mobilization is extremely, extremely difficult, both inside and outside. I think historically, in fact, rather than asserting the radical rupture that the revolution constituted, now a lot of us feel the need to go back, in fact, and sort of look back and look deeper into Syrian history, into the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, to see maybe the continuities rather than the ruptures, rather than discontinuities, in order to ask answer some of the important questions that we're confronted with at the moment. And I think normatively as well, I think there's no way we could honestly, I think, say that the revolution has one normative or constitutes or presents one normative reference for the people who self-identify or identify with the revolution. Let's not forget, you know, in contradistinction or in stark opposition to this notion of Syrians asserting their agency as political actors in 2011, 2012. Now we have Syrians who, you know, identify with the revolution fighting in Libya. We have political bodies and military factions that, you know, that identify with the revolution, that have committed war crimes and continue to commit war crimes, that, you know, sort of champion the cause of the revolution and have the green flag, which for me, the sort of revolutionary moment in 2011, 2012, 2013. So I think we can't really make the argument that the Syrian revolution in a way continues. What does continue, and I think that is very important, is the Syrian quest for freedom, for dignity, and for justice. And I think that's what matters. Not that the revolution continues, but that this quest continues. And when we put the emphasis on that, I think that gives us great sort of an interesting vantage point to also evaluate what's happening now. Because quite frankly, and this is, I'm going to try to be brief because I've been speaking for quite a lot already. I think there are a lot of events that are happening that sort of are continuing the fight for freedom, for justice, for accountability. But at the same, they're not really political in the way the revolution is political. And we can go into detail and talk about different things: bearing witness, documentation, international adjudication, journalism, knowledge production. There are several things that are happening that I think are fantastic, but they're not in the sense, they're not a continuation of the revolution. They're different. They're working with a different reality. They're very, very important. And then there are other things happening maybe inside the country that are that reflect a sense of social mobilization, that sort of continue the sense of politics of protest, social contestation. I think it's very important to look at, for instance, what happened in Sweden at the beginning of this year. Also, like all the different forms of demonstration and civil disobedience and organizing that are happening in the country, but they do not necessarily embody the sense of continuity from 2011. And I think this is also very important. We don't want to go to, for instance, the people in Sweden and ask them, like, do you identify with 2011 or not? Some of these people are 18 or 19 or 20. They were kids when 2011 happened, and we shouldn't turn the revolution of 2011 into a totem or an icon that we need everybody to worship before they engage in politics. So we have, I think, a much more diffuse sort of revolutionary tradition rather than revolution, in my opinion, where certain acts seek to protect the legacy of 2011, but are not necessarily very political in the traditional classical sense of the word. They are non-political, but they have political effects, obviously, so that I don't get misunderstood. Or you have other things happening, mobilization, protest inside Syria, but we can't really still strictly understand them as continuation of the same revolution. And I think that's the right way to go, to historicize 2011 and to understand that we're now confronting a slightly, or not slightly, actually a significantly different objective reality and also normative categories that we need to wrestle with and confront.
Super powerful intervention, which reminds me on our written list of questions, revolution is in quotes. And Karam took that and ran with it to say, to show a really interesting meditation on this word revolution and what it captures and what it doesn't at this moment.
I will go next. I think I belong to those who Karam mentioned slightly, those who feel uncomfortable with the word that the revolution ended. For the main reason, because this trend started around the fall of Aleppo, and it meant different things to different people. It meant at some level, let's go back to Damascus, and let's claim that it was a mistake to begin 2011. It meant to other people that since 2011, it was a terrorism, it was armed fractions of Islamists fighting for political places and to announce emirates and states. So to me, that's why I'm hesitant to accept this, because it came in the moment where Syrians were trying to restore the narrative, and the narrative was shattered all over. So I asked myself immediately after the fall of Aleppo, now what? Maybe because we are a bit faulted by being self-centered around our city, like we felt the defeat for the first time maybe when Aleppo fell. And I asked myself, now what? This is your city, you protested there, you survived so much violence in there, and you witnessed so many people, unfortunately, doesn't have the chance to survive it. So now what? And if you want to go back and become just person to heal and avoid politics and avoid Syria, even pretend you are not Syrians. And I know so many now who are exhausted by the Syrian identity and feeling that it's a burden. It's time to just go become a dentist and leave the Syrian issue as a whole. And what stopped me is I thought of myself as I was young in Aleppo and asked myself what I wanted those who were outside to do. And among things that personally I want us to do, and I think there's a generation who deserve from us, is this preservation of what happened in 2011. And this redefining of what we want the revolution to mean. So if the revolution is this quest for freedom and justice, or is it, here I agree with Karam, is it by itself the mean, the result? Everything we want is a revolution. Do I want a revolution now in Syria if the result is still a genocide? So these questions of how from outside, how us as diaspora can achieve 2-3 things kept in my mind since 2016. How we can preserve the memory of the people who allowed us to speak about Syria with grace. If someone told younger Marcelle that she would be on a panel speaking about Syria publicly, that was never going to happen without people who went on the street in 2011. They brought us this grace of owning Syria and talking about it. Also, our dignity as people who survived. This is our story. We are responsible to say what we did and what are our mistakes. And also, we are responsible to the narrative of the Syrian future. But also, there's a sense of what's next. How we can ensure that it's not only a nostalgia to 2011 and we feel stuck in a past that's not going to happen. I think it's how we keep asking ourselves what's next for Syria and how our effort in organizing gonna lead into democratization of Syria. I think the diaspora now, we have half a population outside the country. And I see the Syrian Revolution, I see it in the grace that Wafa stands in front of a court daily with her father's photo. I see it in the grace that Waad stands in a stage. So I see this grace that of a people who lived the Syrian Revolution, but how we can push it further to become more organized or push it forward so it pushed toward the democratization of Syria. And is it even feasible to achieve democratization or effort toward democratization from outside the country, from the diaspora community outside the country? not from colonial powers, but the diaspora itself. How can we ensure that? To me, I decided, okay, I will write. I will go. There's so many of the Aleppo revolution story is in my memory. And I think Bashar al-Assad wanted us dead. This is a reality. He wanted to kill all of us, to wipe all of us. And the fact that we are not dead yet, it bothered him. So I want to build upon this, what I'm going to do now with the fact that I survived. So the memory and how we preserve it, I think it's part of the resistance. And I think the word resistance fits Syrians now more than the word revolution nowadays. How we can find opportunities for resistance instead of just surrendering to the idea that we live today in a world where genocide happened, where the borders are closed, and when we are identified as victims, like refugees, unwanted refugees most of the time. So how we can resist in all this multiple aspects, I think part of it is to try to find groups and allies inside the Syrian community, especially those who are, Karam mentioned, 18, 20, and who doesn't even know the whole story because there is so many stories competing over the Syrian narrative, and also outside the Syrian circle, who are our true allies, those who are fighting fascism around the world, maybe our allies, and stop obsessing creating allies that think democracy is overrated or they think that Middle East deserve its dictatorship. So to find a new allies, and now being in diaspora, maybe the chance to build such allies.
Well, it's difficult to add lots of things after Karam and Marcelle. It's obvious now for all those who lived through this Syrian tragedy, if you want to call it like that, and those who observed it, those who did position themselves, did go into different debates, struggles, attempts at supporting some dynamics, or just writing about them, analyzing them, defending a certain rhetoric, a certain narrative, that the Syrian Revolution was defeated. This Syrian revolution that from the beginning was an orphaned revolution. Our friend Yassin called it an impossible revolution. Many could call it as well a betrayed revolution. This revolution that went through many phases, starting in 2011, in the summer of that year, the beginning of some militarization, some armed struggle due to the regime barbaric responses. Then in 2012, the first international and regional direct interventions in Syria. Then in 2013, it happened always in summer with the chemical massacre. Then in 2014 with the rise of Daesh. And finally, summer 2015 with the Russian intervention that defeated the revolution, if we want to talk about the military situation. And since that time, it's been one defeat after the other, reducing the territory that once was liberated to the northern west, or the western north of Syria on the one hand, and then with the American occupation or American presence with the Kurdish militias in the northeast and the east of the country. But the whole dynamics and the culture of the revolution and the early energy that this revolution deployed and surprised all of us who were, whether here in Beirut, where I'm now, or in Paris, or in any place, this huge surprise that came, sometimes with joy, sometimes with tears, with hopes, with contradictions, with clashes. Most of us lost many of their friends because of the position when it comes to Syria, especially in intellectual and leftist circles. This phase in history, I agree, was defeated and ended in 2015. But of course, and as Marcelle was saying, the traces are there. There are today still other forms of struggle for Syria. The question of Syria today is a Syrian question first, but is also a universal question when it comes to the quest for justice, to the end of impunity, that I believe is the key in this Middle East, the key when it comes to possible peace and stability one day, because without this, the end of impunity, whether in Palestine or in Syria or in Iraq or in other places or in Lebanon, we will go through one episode of violence to the other. So I think the struggle for the end of impunity, the fight for the narratives, the work that many new organizations are doing. They were born during the revolution. They survived the repression and the massacres and continue to do a great job in writing, in documenting, in arts, in culture, in social support to refugees, and in forms of solidarity among Syrians. All of those were born due to the revolution, and many of them survived the defeat of the revolution, the assassination of the revolution, and continue today here and there, sometimes in an organized manner, sometimes in initiatives that end, but then another initiative starts, and some people who were there will join. Many could criticize that, but this shows that there is something that is still alive when it comes to this will not to accept the end of the quest for justice and for freedom in Syria, but to look for other ways of doing it, by learning also other ways of organizing ourselves, politically speaking, by examining other experiences. I think the Palestinian situation today is as desperate as the Syrian situation is when it comes to the balance of power, when it comes to occupation, when it comes to the absence of any form of justice and even any hope for the short run. But there is a new generation of Syrians, and I see it in France, I see it in Beirut, even if in Beirut the situation is terrible for them economically and in terms of discrimination and other challenges. But there is a new generation outside Syria that did not forget Syria, even if I don't also condemn those who decide to make their choices when it comes to life and accepting and trying to integrate a new culture and a new society. But the Syrian question is still alive, and even with the defeat of the revolution politically and in terms of the military occupation of Syria today by the Russians, by the Iranians, by the Americans, by the Turks, by the different militias in a fragmented territory with lots of issues requiring years and years before finding any decent solution, the Syrian question survived. And Bashar al-Assad, even with the military victory that Russia and Iran offered him, and the inaction of the Western countries offered him, and the complicity of many counter-revolutionary Arab regimes offered him, he can still only rely on the occupation of Syria to survive politically and to continue managing the territory. What remains, in fact, of the Assad state in Syria is mainly the jail, the prison, as a metaphor and as a physical space. That's the only way, the only place in Syria that Assad keeps his sovereignty in a way and continues torturing prisoners and their families and keeping the Syrians like ghosts in that sense when they are under his control. We don't know who's alive, who's dead, where are the bodies, can we mourn the dead people. But other than this terrible, in fact, tool that he still use against the Syrian people when it comes to politics, when it comes to security, when it comes to economics, when it comes to all aspects of any state organization. This is about Russia, about Iran, about regional forces, about the US, about international affairs and international impact on the Syrian situation. And this means that even if the revolution was defeated and terribly defeated, it weakened a lot that regime and showed how fragile it is without the foreign occupation supporting it.
So much food for thought. Thanks to all three of you. So to pick up with some of the last comments that Ziad was mentioning and using the word defeat, and this is another word that we can sort of put in quotes. For many years now, people have been talking about the current situation regarding the Syrian resistance or quest for justice and freedom or revolution as defeat or after the defeat. And many ask, what went wrong? What do you think about these kinds of discussions about defeat or what went wrong? And looking back at experiences since 2011, or perhaps as Karam was mentioning, even much further back than that, what are lessons to be learned? And what does it even mean to learn lessons? And what is the best way to approach even thinking about these past 9+ years in terms of this idea of defeat, or if that's even the appropriate word? And again, whoever might want to jump in.
You want me to jump in?
Please, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I feel like because it's been so long that I spoke about the Syrian Revolution in English to a wider audience, I've been stuck in this sort of like internal Syrian room, working in Arabic, and I feel like because probably when you take for granted the fact that everybody around you is committed to the quest for the struggle, for the quest for justice and dignity and freedom, you allow yourself to be, much more thorough in your criticism. And so I am afraid I'm going to come across again as a bit of a Grinch in the sense that my take on the sort of practices of self-criticism, not only there are a lot of people who are doing fantastic work when it comes to probably writing more in depth about what has happened and how do we go from there. But that is one thing I think. And the whole question or formation or approach of what went wrong, which is not only limited to, for instance, activist circles or in-depth writing, but also, to be honest, on Facebook and Twitter, on social media, people who are writing shorts. And again, we're talking about the people who took part in the revolution, who mobilized, who organized, who advocated, who saw their entire lives changed as a result of the last 9 years, and who are still extremely and passionately committed to the cause. And yet, I feel like I hate to use a psychological language, but I feel one mode of coping with this defeat, with the fact that we're now in a completely different reality, which I think is not necessarily defined only by defeat, because again, as I said, the quest as a quest continues in many ways and many creative avenues and methods. But in general, people try to say what went wrong. They look for one specific answer that somehow summarizes everything. I would say, and I'm going to allow myself to be harsh somewhat, I would say that a lot of these answers, again, we're talking here about people expressing themselves in social media, in Arabic, internal Syrian discussions. I would say, by and large, I would say a lot of these answers are a bit reductive in the sense that they're looking just for one main reason why the revolution failed, because it was militarized, because it was not properly militarized, because there was a lot of international intervention, because there was not enough international intervention, because it was because the countryside dominated the city. No, it's precisely because of the cities. There are all sorts of sort of reductive, in my opinion, exercises or practices in self-criticism, which are exactly that. Because if you ask, but just what went wrong, and you want to find it just in one essence or one thing that basically happened, you end up with something which is, again, very simplistic and very reductive. I think some of these also attempts have been not reflective, but rather reflexive, in the sense that rather than just sitting and taking everything in and looking at the complexity of everything that happened, I feel like a lot of these answers that we provide so quickly are somewhat reenactions of some of the very same fault lines of Syrian opposition politics from even before the Syrian Revolution, and especially during the first 3-4 years of the Syrian Revolution. And so in a way, they're not really reflective. They're not basically trying to take everything in account for the complexity of everything that happened, but reenact very much in a somewhat sectarian manner, not in the Syrian sense of like sects and communities, but really in the ideological sense, or in the sort of factional sense of having different factional silos who have always sort of had one particular understanding of why things happened the way they did. And so a lot of the self-criticism is not really self-criticism, but just reenacting some of these sort of fault lines and some of these divisive discursive practices. Now, the third thing, to be honest, and again, I'm assuming here that we're like speaking to a community that, again, shares our commitments. I think most of them share to have the sort of explanatory power that they sort of present themselves to have. And to be more specific, you know, because I've been following this a lot in Al Jamhuriya, we got a lot of articles, a lot of people want to weigh in on why the revolution failed. Was it in 2011 when we accepted it to become a military struggle? Was it afterwards when we sort of struck some sort of a modus vivendi? I'm talking here about the progressive or liberal or secular camp with sort of the conservative political Islamist camp, or is it because of the opposition? And I feel it lacks this explanatory power because it cannot really confront two main things. First, the structural limitations of Syrian society. I mean, perhaps it's not really because one thing or the other that the Syrian revolutionaries or any actor within the Syrian revolution did, but really because Syrian society, the Syrian polity, the very basically structural conditions of Syrian national identity, it sort of broke down as a result of the revolution. And whether it's along class lines or regional lines or sectarian lines or ideological lines, there's this sort of structural quality to what happened post-2011 that as Syrians who are trying to really produce reflective and thoughtful understanding of what happened, we have to account for. We can't just say we did this wrong or that wrong. We have to take into consideration these structural limitations, A. And then B, and this is again because, I mean, I'm very much interested in this sort of exercise of self-criticism, but there's not one thing quite frankly, that I feel I can just pinpoint very openly about what we, you know, people who are committed to freedom and justice and dignity did wrong, without basically taking into account the unspeakable levels of violence that we were being subjected to in the country all along. And so whether we failed to organize in a certain manner, whether we felt that certain things were not priorities and that we had to talk about them later, whether the sort of political organizing that we did and the sort of bifurcation between opposition outside and opposition inside, all of these things turned out to be major deficiencies in the Syrian sort of political struggle. But at the same time, it is very hard for me to understand how we could have done things differently given the unspeakable levels, the horrific levels of violence that we were enduring, that the Syrian people endured, first, obviously, and mostly all throughout by the Syrian regime and its backers in Iran and Russia, but also obviously from 2013 and 2014 onwards, also by radical Islamists, all the way obviously down to all the different national parties, or I should say international parties that are involved in Syria, who are all invariably accused of having committed war crimes. Now, I'm just saying all of that, not to say we can't practice self-criticism, but I think we need a little bit more time. We need to be more reflective, and we need for a minute, again, as I was saying in the first, to historicize the revolution, rather than to think of ourselves as just political actors still living in 2011, 2012. We need to look at this revolution as a complex historical process, to know that we've passed to a new phase, to look at it in its totality, to historicize it. And I think once we historicize it, once we look at it completely and reflectively in this new original way that it deserves, I think that is very important for us to come up with new tools, both organizationally and again, ideologically or intellectually, to know how to organize, again, as Syrians inside the country or as diasporic Syrians in order to continue the struggle. So in order for this fight not to be just about documentation or international adjudication or bearing witness or the fight for the narratives, which are all fantastic, but to be able to also resume or take back political initiative in ways and in words that make sense, that can rally also people again. So that's my quick take, and I hope I didn't sound too pessimistic, and I was able to relay what I was exactly trying to say.
I totally agree with Karam. I think I have a huge problem with the self-revision of the Syrian Revolution because first, the motive that came behind a self-hate speech, that there is a huge problem with our people, and we are trying to diagnose it now and understand what the problem with the Syrian people that we might be able to fix, or even it can't be fixed forever, so dictatorship is a must in the region. So this motive, when it happened a lot, it minimized the effect of violence. So everyone knows that the regime has implemented a huge amount of violence, but to them that shouldn't change the dynamics. Personally, I know 100 people who were being killed. 100, not one, not two, more than 100. And those who revise our political behavior, they revise it as if this 100 doesn't change anything. Aleppo revolution should stay the same. Although its best people are being killed, tortured, besieged, it's gonna, our political behavior should be as its best, regardless of our circumstances. And that's not human to expect anyone, because I wasn't the same after that. And I accept that I wasn't the same, because this idea that violence brings people together, yeah, a little bit maybe, but this romanticization that violence will bring us, it's not. It breaks Syria. It broke our cities. We lost the best of our people. We buried the best of our people. So if we bury the best of our people, that will affect this, how things gonna fold up in the future. So this lack of compassion and also the minimize of effect of violence. And why is that? No one want to sit with the problem. No one want to sit and think of state violence and blame it. It become okay, Bashar al-Assad is fascist. That's common sense. Let's move beyond it. But we are not beyond it. In real life, we are not beyond his violence. So I can't just ignore and jump over just to see. And also, no one want to sit with the international violence. There's too many layers of international violence in Syria and still happening outside of Syria to those who survived. Why I'm so harsh on this kind of criticism? Because it created this sense of responsibility on the shoulders of those who survived. What I should have done better. While hiding, while under barrel bombs, while my friends were killed, I was like, oh, other Syrians are saying that something should have been different. And then it's those who were in the front lines in 2011 with their limited support needed to do it differently. The other reason why I'm so worried of this over-revision of self-criticism is sometimes it works as taming for a future generation, as let's tell future generation not to do it again. Because see what happened when you go up in the street, this what happened. And if this is the lesson learned, I wish we never learned it. I wish, because we didn't lose that much to reach this, to reach that the Syrian people doesn't deserve democracy. There's something inherently wrong in the Syrian community that let's keep the dynamics and the power in place. So if this is what we are looking for the lesson learned, I wish we never learned it. But on the same aspect, there is a lesson to need to be learned, and it's an eye to the outside sometimes. How we can prevent genocide from becoming the norm. When the Egyptian people went in the street 2 months ago, I wasn't excited. I was afraid. And recognizing this fear, which I'm not a person who usually gets scared easily. I was scared. And this fear came of okay, we have fascism or new fascism. And then we have military, and we have people in the street. Then genocide. So to me, this linkage with genocide is so intimate in a way that how we can, from outside, change this from becoming the norm. We don't want the norm to be anyone who tried to protest is going to be crushed, and their city is going to be crushed, and their friends going to be crushed. This lesson learned is, let's see what happened. What happened that the genocide was an option? and why it is an option and why people threaten with the Syrian scenario nowadays. So this, I'm interested to see how we can prevent it from happening for other, and also for a selfish reason, for Syrians, because I'm quite sure Syrians gonna go against Bashar al-Assad again. In 10 years, in 15 years, some people tell me that I'm optimistic. I have a huge faith that the Syrian gonna go in the streets again, because the amount of, not only because we are politicalized, but the amount of violence that stripe your dignity inside Syria is huge. He doesn't know any other tool beside genocide, prisons, tortures. He doesn't know anything to give us besides trying to stripe our dignity. So resistance become our must. So 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, and I think I'm looking at that moment and saying like, how we can at least ensure them a different ending. If there is something we can think of is how we can ensure them some sense of safety. Not safety because like, okay, you knew Bashar al-Assad was dictator from the beginning. Yeah, we knew. But I never thought that I would be in a room with my friends discussing what if he used chemical weapons in Aleppo. This is another level of state violence. So unless we sit with this state violence and address the horrible atrocities that happened in Syria, self-criticism would become blaming those who survived on the amount of violence that they lived.
To continue with what Karam and Marcell were saying, I think the problem of the question about the lessons learned and about what went wrong is that it might reduce the whole Syrian struggle and what happened in the last 9 years into the analysis of mistakes committed, and definitely there were mistakes, by the political opposition, by the armed groups, maybe sometimes expecting things that never happened. And you can also say that people should have analyzed better the balance of power, the regional relations, the international relations. We can always think of errors, and we can always consider that in some moment maybe some decisions could have been avoided, others could have been taken. The way the Syrian opposition negotiated with its allies could have been different. The way many became hostages to Qatar or to Saudi Arabia is definitely problematic. The fact that some of the opponents underestimated the resilience of the regime and its allies, especially the determination of Iran first and its capacity to mobilize militias from all over the region. And then the Russian intervention that was decisive. We can always talk about it. But what I think is sometimes missing, and Marcell and Karam both mentioned it directly and indirectly, is the fact that also things in 9 years changed a lot, and there were mutations on the ground in the society, within the political spectrum, within the military dynamics. I don't believe in essences, and I don't believe in something that is set culturally and is primordial in a way to give an explanation of anything. Things did move, change. There were modifications. Time and violence are two factors that in any context play against a possible change, because time would make lots of changes, tiredness, people fatigue, people could be sometimes just leaving, abandoning, trying to survive, and the amount of violence that Syria witnessed, I don't think that can be compared to any violence we have seen before in such condensed and in such a terrible way, from the chemical attacks to the barrel bombs, to the hunger war, to torture in jail, kidnapping, bombing, massacres. All kind of violence with impunity, once again, was used in years and did make the the political analysis and sometimes the will to create good alliances, not only impossible, but compared to what people are witnessing and the way they were just trying to survive, everything becomes, relatively speaking, less important and difficult to manage. So we can, of course, talk about errors. We can, of course, say that maybe sectarianism was underestimated when violence is a model in the conflict that the regime imposed and that had roots and echoes in the society itself. Maybe some people underestimated the fact that there would be no limits to the violence of the regime and no intervention whatsoever will happen to not allow him to continue to after the chemical weapon and the famous red line. Maybe some people couldn't expect Russia to intervene. This, of course, plays in the way the assessment of the situation and what kind of positions and policies should be elaborated based on that. But regardless of this, violence, once again, and time played against the revolution, against the Syrian people, and allowed the regime and its allies to impose finally the situation that we have, where Syria is fragmented, occupied, and a large part of its population is outside. So this is not the conclusion, this is not the end of the Syrian struggle, of course, but this is a very difficult phase, and the challenges will continue to impose themselves on all those who are struggling or trying to think of another Syria.
Excellent. So all three of you did a great job of showing what's wrong with the question, what went wrong. So we can all think about that next time we hear that question come up worded in that way. Now to move on to a slightly different angle. The title of this panel is Where Next for the Syrian Struggle? And we have been and usually talk about this on the political level of the struggle for freedom and justice and struggle against the Assad regime. But what does it mean on the personal level and the social level? At the level of identity, what does it mean today to be a Syrian who resists or who engages in this quest? Here, feel free to reflect on your own experience or what you're observing more broadly.
I will take from Karam the beginning because he was looking at me to do it. The first thing that I think I'm sometimes boring people of how much I'm talking about it. The first thing next is to heal. The responsibility of the survivors is to heal because Bashar al-Assad wants to break us, so healing is resistance. If we are broken, then he achieved his aim while we are outside the country. Sometimes I feel he can break me from outside if I'm like, I don't resist this. So healing means sometimes to look back and try to find the meaning. And I think the battle of finding a meaning of what happened is difficult. I used to take it for granted, like, yeah, if I sit with what happened, then I will figure out the meaning. No, unfortunately not. I wish things were simple because there is a level of violence that sometimes is meaningless, and trying to humanize it and put meaning into it doesn't make you in peace with the world and doesn't make you able to resist for another day. So this struggle for meaning, sometimes we need to come together to do it together. Like, we survived that much. Let's see how we can go forward. Healings to me meant writing. I'm writing now a memoir about Syria, so that also is part of what next to me is to look at and answer what happened and what we did, and to regain some of my grace. Yeah, we did brave things. We did heroic things. We resisted so many layers of occupation, Islamist, airstrikes. So to regain this, because sometimes we are defining ourselves only by the defeat and only by the ending, which is not fair to our journey. So this is what next. What next socially? Even if you decide to get rid of your Syrian identity, the passport and the world that hate refugees won't allow you to. So I think embracing it would be tactical, not only a choice. Like, yeah, we are Syrian and we are refugees now, and we need even to speak politically about our asylum. We need to bring it more into attention and to fight for a better situation to our life. So on that, but yeah, I think that's where next is going to me, social and personally.
Okay, just to pick up on some of the same themes, but also to admit or confess that when I first read this question, I felt slightly uncomfortable as well. And it actually, without wanting to philosophize too much, but it also reminded me a bit of this famous question that Günter Grass, I think, asked Hannah Arendt, like, don't you love the Jewish people? And she said, I love my friends. For me, the Jewish people, it's a political cause. You know, and so for me, being a Syrian revolutionary is a political question. For me, even if I understand politics as a personal also sense of engagement and involvement and something which is inseparable to the way I understand myself, but I don't sleep and eat and think and laugh like a Syrian revolutionary. And I think in the sense, to take care of ourselves or to think of ourselves as Syrian revolutionaries personally and socially, the way forward is not to think of ourselves as only Syrian revolutionaries, to retrieve that bit in ourselves, which is not simply defined by the fact that we are Syrians who endured this trauma and that we are political activists who somehow draw their sustenance and their sense of meaning from this fight. We do all of these things, but at the same time, we need to also take care of each other. We need to take care of ourselves in the sense of creating these, emotional and social and personal spaces that are not, simply reduced to the fact that we are activists or Syrians or refugees. We are, individuals, human beings, partners, family members. And that, I think, is important, not just in the sense of, to sort of, reenact or talk about the public versus the private, which I think is important in exactly the sense that Hannah Arendt talks about. But I think it's also important to de-romanticize the notion of a unified or unitary sort of Syrianness. I mean, there are multiple ways for people to be Syrian. So surely the Syrian bit of being Syrian revolutionary, one could inhabit or forget or come back to in multiple ways, in infinite ways. And I don't want to say something, I don't want to come across as basically saying, like this was an old generation, like generations would direct to revolutionary generations where like, everything is about the revolution, everything is about politics, everything about, breathing the cause. I don't want us to leave the session with this specific lesson. I think it's very, very problematic and quite authoritarian, quite frankly, one. And two, also de-romanticizing the notion of the Syrian revolutionary. It also means confronting the notion that we, whether it's us men as opposed to women, or the fact that there are within the Syrian revolutionary, this is not a monolithic community. There are people with power and people with less power. There are men and women. There are straight people and queer people. There are people who come from the big cities and who have access to, and there are people who don't. There are people now who find themselves in leading positions in, for instance, the NGO sector or the Syrian CSO. And so there are bosses who are like I am, for instance, in an organization where I lead 20 people. And so the fact that I just think of myself as a Syrian revolutionary might, in a way, to romanticize myself as a Syrian revolutionary would basically mean, I don't get to keep myself in check for the fact that I'm not just a Syrian revolutionary. I'm also a person at the moment in a position of power, and I need to always check in, this sense of power or privilege when I'm living my Syrian revolutionness. The other thing is also, quite frankly, not only retrieving that private, I hate to use the word private, I find it sometimes to be simplistic, but that sense of that we're not just Syrian revolutionaries, that the Syrian revolutionary is political first and foremost. It's not like everything that we do, but it's also about, not falling into some sort of a Syrian exceptionalism or a Syrian sense of an isolationist sort of discourse, which I think has actually somewhat evolved post-revolution, and for understandable reasons. For 40 years, Syrians were told that they were not even Syrian, they're Arab. There's no such thing as Syrian politics. It's only Arab politics, and it's only the struggle against the United States or imperialism or what have you. And so we created the sense of national Syrian politics, but I think it's also important to remain vigilant or cognizant of the fact that we don't want to become, to recreate sort of an echo chamber like other countries and like other activist communities, where we only discuss what's ours and we remain sort of oblivious to what's happening in the world. And so in a sense, we could be revolutionaries, but not necessarily through traditional sense of being focused only on the Syrian revolution. We could be fighting other battles, and we could be becoming politicized through other sort of sites and countries, especially obviously in the diaspora, but also within Syria. It's not just the one main battle of the Syrian revolution. There are multiple things through which people are sort of reenacting or living their sense of agency, their sense of their attempt to be owners or authors of what's happening around them. And surely they need to also take a break sometimes from this battle and just try as hard as possible, hard as it is for Syrians, to live as just, people who think and love and read and struggle and feel pain and feel loss like every other person, not only just as traumatized Syrians.
Yeah, I fully agree. I'm not Syrian myself, and I don't really know how to define a Syrian revolutionary today. I think many, through discovering new aspects of politics, new struggles, the feminist struggle, struggle for social justice, in the places where they are as refugees, or inside the country, or in forums where they might be, or in new organizations, just being in a new life, in fact, the one that opened their eyes, the one that will keep them, of course, concerned with Syria and the quest for justice and freedom in Syria, but at the same time not to keep acting only as victims, nor only as militants, because there are other aspects in life related to culture, related to music, related to arts, related to what many of the Syrians are anyway doing and creating, that could keep at the same time their human contribution to universal questions, one important possibility, a real potential, and their connection to Syria through what they will create and through what they will write and the way they will live their new lives and new conditions. Being Syrians would also bring Syria to the world and would create more and more possible alliances, more and more parallelisms with other struggles. So I think that today, for someone concerned with changing not only the regime in Syria, but many of the structures in the Syrian society, in the Syrian politics, political arena, but beyond that, it is important to be part of different struggles, whether, as I said, for human rights, for feminism, for social justice, for the environment, for new education, for the narratives, of course. And I think many Syrians are today either outside the country or still in the country, but mainly due to their relatives outside, due to social networks, to their readings, to their connection with the world. They are contributing to the objectives of a Syrian revolution, not the Syrian revolution, but a Syrian revolution. And in that sense, we can make comparisons with the Palestinians, we can make comparisons with many other peoples. The Lebanese during a certain moment of time in the 70s, where it was important to contribute to knowledge, to contribute to art, to poetry, to literature. I think being a revolutionary only, if we can put it like that, would not mean lots of things in the situation today. It should be always connected to other aspects of of life, of engagement, involvement in causes, and in a quest for justice everywhere.
So much to think about. It looks like we'll have time to maybe just have this be the last question that I will pose to the group, and then we can move to questions that have been posted on the comment section. So to close us out for today, where does the Syrian struggle go from here? What should be the priorities for the future? What are the things that you think activists and allies should be doing or should not be doing? How does or should the Syrian Revolution or Syrian struggle relate to other struggles for justice, freedom, and political transformation in the region or around the world? What do these struggles in other countries and contexts mean for Syria and vice versa? So there are a lot of questions in there. Feel free to pick out any one or ones that inspire you to chime in.
Can I just start here? I'm not going to say what Syrian activists would do or could do, but just as someone who's very much concerned with Syria, with lots of human ties to Syria, I think that my contribution, for instance, would be to keep just explaining the Syrian question, describing the situation in Syria, trying to bring notions from Syria to the public in France or in Lebanon or in other places, and to work to end the impunity of the Syrian regime and its allies, and impunity in Syria in general, in fact. I think, once again, impunity is the key for someone who can work from the outside in order to not only use the documentation that is very rich and has been taking place for years now about all kinds of violations, but to see mechanisms and to look for mechanisms allowing justice finally to start functioning or working when it comes to clear cases of crimes against humanity, of war crimes. And I think for those who are living outside, there are regularly in the media, in the academic circles, in the political circles, in the political parties, whether on the left or on the right, there are always fights and clashes with the pro-Syrian regime, with those who are always justifying what happened in Syria and defending Russian approaches, trying to just blame, I don't want to say the victim, but those who did the revolution against regime for what happened. And our responsibility as well is to respond to their arguments, to always bring our narratives, to use the experiences and to learn from the experiences of the Syrians themselves, and to try to present it to the public opinion, but also to political militants in other countries, in order to create what you asked about, kind of alliances or kind of cooperation, and to open their eyes on what's happening in Syria, and that it's not that complicated if we want to understand it, and if we want to have at least an ethical stance about it, even before being into an advanced political stance. So I guess our role as non-Syrian in support of the Syrian struggle is mainly to work on that. And of course, if we can, on solidarity in a country like Lebanon with the Syrian refugees, because of all what they might suffer and what they already suffered in the country today due to the discrimination and to the racist behavior of many Lebanese politicians or just citizens.
What's next? I think when I think how the revolution began as a group activities, as protests in the street with people who doesn't know each other but needs a lot of trust. You will tell someone about a protest and they can easily put you in a situation that gets you killed. And that amount of trust was lost over the time into totally individualized approach of politics. Instead of the group occupying the street, everyone want to work on project that's individualized. Memory, culture, writing, one person with 2-3 friends. And even those friends might clash along the road. So I think restoring our ability to build something in a community and together is part of the next step. Imagine that I agree with Karam politically on the last 10 years, almost on everything, and which is huge in Syria. To have that on Syria, like that means you agree about the situation on the Kurdish cause and the women cause, and like so there's so layers of disagreement that broke people apart. But still, there is no body or meeting or any way of activity that we do together, and that wasn't the case in 2011. Although in 2011, me meeting him personally would be kind of impossible, but still we have more groups in common to discuss, to think, to brainstorm. So I think now restoring some sense of group work and trust should be our next step going forward. And maybe we will clash, maybe we will come into the table with too much battles that would make any organizing work fall apart. But I think trying to sit together and say, like, let's try working together again. And I think that happened from the tansiqiyat, the coordinates. When the NGOization happened, we lost faith in the group work altogether, because suddenly it's not the coordinate. We thought it might be, but it's not. It's not as brave. It's not as honest. It's not as transparent. It's not as obsessed with the Syrian community freedom. And suddenly I'm like, what we are doing? So now we are the phase, every Syrian wants to work on their archive alone, on their story alone. How we can make this back into a group work around Syria? This is, to me, the next question. And if there is no one you trust in Syria, that's another problem, because that means you love the Syrian Revolution and hate Syrians. And that's dangerous. If you love the Syrian Revolution and romanticize the Syrian Revolution and hate Syrians, that's a huge problem, because there's so much feminism about like this. There's so much fight for refugees and hate refugees. And we don't want to be those people. We want to love our people, and we want to love ourselves and try to create a group work. This is, to me, really important in the next phase for the Syrian Revolution. And the other thing is, let's be brave again around the topics we avoided for long. The Kurdish, we have a responsibility toward the Kurdish cause. We have the responsibility toward women equality. We are so behind. And it's like, I think we tried so much to be brave in one battle, and then when the Islamists when they tried to be another fascism, like, no, that's another battle. I think now we need to be more brave, to be ethical with ourselves, to be true to our cause, is like to bring more to the table. Maybe we can't fix it. Maybe it's international geopolitics. It's not every time we need to sit on the table as a bunch of Syrians who are not supported legally or financially trying to solve the broken planet. But we need to sit together to think of our own responsibility, and also to create this group trust of, like, yeah, there's people who we agree on that no one's village should be occupied. No one's village need to be occupied. So I think this also did. But to that happen, that's why when Karam was talking about restoring the private and not only, I was like, yeah, but if a Syrian family wants to meet, it needs 6 visas, and it needs, like, the family not to take a photo if the mother is going back to Damascus, because if they took a photo, the regime. So yeah, I used to be funny. I used to sing and dance. I'm still funny, but not as much as before, because suddenly everything intensified in a way that even having a party means, who's gonna see it? Are they in a terrible situation? Every simple act of joy became so difficult to achieve. I agree that we need to restore that back also, but to do that, I think we need to speak about our rights as refugees more and more, because now we are dealt with in a way that prevent us from being friends, prevent us from being parents, prevent us from being sons and daughters. Like, we are not allowed legally to go and become sisters. Just if my sister want to see me, I'm not allowed legally just to go and see her and be a sister. So she was worried about me 3-4 years of her life because I was gonna be killed. And suddenly she can't see me because our paperwork won't allow it. So I think also we need to do that, more talk about how Syrians now and how refugees in general, and that also open our alliances with people who lived like this as refugees, and we were isolated inside Syria and didn't hear their life stories. And I think also what we need to do is listen to others. Sometimes even when the Lebanese revolution is starting with the Egyptian, we want to compare. And I think no, the right approach sometimes just to go back and listen to other people's stories, because also they have a lot that's happening in their life. And if it's not genocide, we should be glad. We shouldn't be feeling like, oh, if they are not living genocide, then they don't deserve it. Our aim should be no one should be facing genocide ever again.
It's hard to add to what Ziad and Marcell covered so eloquently and so meticulously. But I'm just going to mention, like, just off the top of my head, and I'm going to address my own generation, to be honest. And so I'm not talking to like older people. I'm talking to or younger people. I'm talking to my generation in particular, people who were like around 28, 29, 27, 28 when the revolution happened, people who consider the Syrian Revolution 2011 as probably the most important, most definitive year of their lives, and who are just now sort of graduating from being, young to being sort of, in their 40s. I think one of the most important things is to continue to bear witness. And by bearing witness, to be honest, I don't just mean being, like doing the advocacy or protecting the narrative or pushing for more documentation. I feel like oftentimes we feel that we know everything that has happened and we're embattled activists, and so we just need to like continue to basically tell everybody the lesson that we've already memorized. We need to maintain that level or that notion of early empirical curiosity that sort of pervaded Syrians about other Syrians in 2011, 2012. I want to know, bearing witness means to me that acknowledging that I don't really know people who are 16 or 17 or 18 inside Syria or in Germany or in Sweden who are just coming of age, who are just realizing what it means to be Syrian, revolutionary or not, cognizant of a political position or not, refugee or not. Like, I want to know more about these people, because if we don't engage those people, then obviously with time we're going to sound like a broken record, a small echo chamber that just repeat the same slogans and the same ideals, and we're just engaging sort of an external audience, a very politicized audience, but losing sight of the Syrians, the young Syrians that are just coming of age now. They're just forming their ideas about what it means to be Syrian and what it means to be in this world at this very difficult and sort of dark moment in Syrian history. So bear witness, I think that's very important. The second thing, I think institutional building. I think we've always had fantastic Syrians who are fantastic, individual achievers, creators, whether writers, academics, political activists, like Syrian doctors in the US are pretty famous, but what we lack is building institutions, Syrian institutions that embody the values of freedom, democracy, pluralism, and has this sort of what sociology professors a long time ago used to call institutional durability and flexibility. We build institutions that can last, that outlast their founders, that build traditions of power sharing and decision making, and sort of protocols where Syrians as Syrians sort of engage the public sphere, not just as individuals, but as people who are committed to these bodies, whether they are political or intellectual or cultural or advocacy based or legal and human rights based. We need to build lasting, adaptable, sustainable, democratic institutions. This is extremely important, in my opinion. The third thing, I feel like a lot of us feel that in 2011, 2012, we sort of pursued the logic of priorities, that now the main focus should be on getting Bashar al-Assad out, on just the democratic transition. And we sort of felt a sense of regret, because there were a lot of these other freedoms and other values that we sort of felt that this is not so important. Now what matters is for us to build a broad coalition for democratic transition and democratic change. And so a lot of questions, especially when it comes to personal freedoms, especially when it comes to questions that have to do with faith, that have to do with feminism, that have to do with sexuality, that have to do with any sense of cultural dissidence. Even though the revolution, in a way, dialectically empowered these voices in specific circumscribed communities, there was this sort of logic, national logic, that all of this can wait. Now we need to focus on just this battle. Now I feel like a lot of us want to expand, the front of the Syrian struggle into all of these areas. And as actually the publisher of Al Jumhuriya, we have this thing called the analytics. To be honest, articles that we publish on these issues about faith, about sexuality, about a cultural identity, about what it means to be a Syrian in Berlin now, going to a nightclub and experiencing all of these things, which in 2011 seemed to us to be not important, things that we need to postpone until later. And I think probably, again, in the sense of the historical process, maybe in 2011, that's what made sense. I think we are all called upon to let go of this logic of the hierarchies, the priorities, and just push on all levels, on all fronts, and to sort of embody these values of freedom, emancipation, justice, equality for all amongst on all fronts, without this notion of priorities and hierarchy of suffering. And then, to be honest, I think what really matters, two more things. First, confront the Syrian question. Like my generation, a lot of our preceding generations, intellectuals, political activists, they give us these tools, and we use these tools up until the revolution and then slightly afterwards. Now we need to think and ponder, what is this thing called Syria, the Syrian national identity, the Syrian political community? Is there such a thing as a Syrian national community that can survive? Or what's there? How do we reformulate a vision, a political program for the political struggle, not just in the language of the narrative, the memory, what happened to us as traumatized, as battered Syrians, but also, not just again, as philosophers would say, not just the struggle for liberation, but then the next step, how to build a house for freedom. How do you come together as Syrians and you set new terms for us to live together? Because that has to happen. And so we need to confront this question very honestly and very candidly and pluralistically, and without obviously compromising any of the revolutionary values, but we need to take that step further, and a very, very honest one. And it definitely needs to include elements that for the past 8 years we just thought of as, the other side that we don't want to think of. At some point, when Assad is out of the picture, we need to confront that, and we need to think about that. And then the last thing, beyond the thinking, bearing witness, the intellectual process, expanding the struggle and building institutions, we need to come back to the question of political organization. This has to do with the diaspora. There's not a single promising political Syrian progressive political body that seems to be active at the moment, that seems to have real value and import and cachet among, large swaths of Syrians. And so this is, I think, a big unanswered question that I think will take us years to answer, and many, many actual organizational attempts. And so I think those, to be honest, this is like a to-do list for the next maybe 10 years.
Well, excellent. There's so much more to talk about. Let's move to some questions that have been posted in the comment section. And here I want to apologize to the audience in advance that we probably won't get to all of these great questions, but we'll surely get to as many as we can. And for the panelists, you can all chime in, but if there's a question you want to pass on, no problem. Just chime in if you want, and then we'll keep moving to other questions. So I'd like to start with the very first question that was posted on comments from Mark Hakim, and he sort of begins where Karam just left off in mentioning the diaspora. So here's Mark's question. Can Syria pro-democracy diaspora organize elections to vote democratically for their representatives, like what pro-democracy population in Hong Kong did recently? Is something like this possible? And here I'd add, maybe to make this question a little bit broader, in general, as Marcell mentioned earlier, there are millions of Syrians outside the country, outside Syria. What are the general limits possibilities for the role of the diaspora, and how should the diaspora or different communities within it organize effectively along the lines that Karam was also talking about, institution building and so forth.
Mark Hakim himself is someone who's very active in Paris with the Syrian diaspora. And I think what he's doing and what many other people are doing in terms of organizing events, explaining the Syrian question, attending different events, not only on Syria, but on also other struggles and other causes, and trying to bring a Syrian dimension and perspective to those things is what many could do as well, and what many are doing. Now, there is a need to develop more institutions, maybe to move from the initiative and the sit-in and the conference to have something that would gather more Syrians and their friends together to become more influential as well, politically and socially and culturally in the different countries where there are today hundreds of thousands or thousands of Syrians living and interacting with their new societies. But I'm not sure that organizing elections is, the urgent thing to do, even if this is a legitimate question, of course, and elections can take different forms when it comes to electing also maybe bodies in institutions that could coordinate the work related to Syria, could lobby for Syria, could explain to the media, to politicians, to those who are interested and want to do something, what forms of support, what forms of cooperation could be possible based on the needs and the experiences of the Syrians so far.
Marcelle and Karam, do you have any ideas on this question of the diaspora, how it can organize itself?
I love the idea in principle, but at the same time, I feel like before elections, there's this incredible form of democratic and direct politics where we establish, we start with councils and clubs where people, or clubs, it's an old word, but councils and lobbies and associations for Syrians to actually come together and engage and talk before we go ahead and do the elections. Because I also have some pretty sort of funny but slightly also traumatizing memories from 2011, 2012, when we used to conduct these, Facebook elections or selections of, who would you want the next Syrian leader to be? And obviously this depends on the fact, Syrians did not really know each other so well. Syrians continue to depend almost exclusively on Syrian Facebook to get to know each other, to build a public sphere. And somehow Facebook played a very positive, or social media played a very positive role in the early years of the revolution. But now I would argue it plays a very negative role, because somehow if you live in Canada, instead of going in Toronto, for instance, or in Berlin or in Paris, instead of taking an interest in creating, say, for instance, a Syrian democratic lobby council, townhouse, whatever club in Berlin, and getting to know other people and building relations and building also political rapport, the business of politics, as they say. Instead, people just stick to their profile, their social media pages, where they're just engaging within the same echo chamber that includes 5, 10, 20, 30 people spread out all over the world. So maybe prior to elections, we need to engage in this idea of forming areas, city-specific, town-specific bodies and lobbies where people come together, discuss ideas, build profiles, distinguish themselves, by the just basic political skills of who knows how to make an argument better, who's a more compelling speaker, who's a more forceful leader, who's who's better at this business of politics, so that we gradually build a new generation of political leaders that are, again, maybe not elected, but sort of organically bottom up, sort of emerge out of this process.
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
I'm trying to give time for another question, but if you want me to.
Sure. Yeah, we can come back to this question of the diaspora and its proper role. But let's go ahead and move to another question. So there were two questions related to healing that took up this really important comment from Marcelle about the role of healing as the next step. So I'd like to read both of these questions and you guys can respond to them. So the first is from Alma, who said, and directing this specifically to Karam, but anybody can jump in. Would zooming out and historicizing the lived moment give revolutionaries peace and healing? And then Yoshka also had a question on healing, and she asked, should the struggle prioritize healing, and how is this related to the emerging legal activities that are developing? For example, the several court cases in Europe against the regime and its crimes. So either question or both, feel free to jump in.
You go, Karam, because the question is addressing you.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest, I have all sorts of apprehensions about like psychologizing a political struggle too much. I really think that healing is a key category, but at the same time, for me, perhaps it's not just healing, it's probably also like recentering ourselves as Syrians and knowing exactly what is it, where do we stand in this current moment, and what does this sort of moral or ethical commitment to freedom and justice actually entail for us. So rather than just be completely sort of paralyzed by the sense of either defeat or by this notion of, the structural limitations of our positions, either as Syrians in Syria or as Syrians outside Syria, I feel truly that to take a step back, to understand that the best history that we're going to write about the Syrian Revolution cannot be done right now in one spot. We cannot just simply identify one simple cause for why everything went wrong, and take in this complexity, historicize it, so that it's not past, it's history. It's not revolution, it's revolutionary tradition. I think it really helps us recenter ourselves and understand exactly what is it that we have to do in this next phase. Obviously, the sense of trauma, the sense of the house that we live in being haunted by many ghosts from time past. I mean, every single one of us lost so many close friends and family members. And so we feel the sense that, we are traumatized. We feel that the minute we think about historicizing and reflecting, we might be betraying someone or something. But I think it's a must for us to understand exactly how to see the way forward. So healing privately, sure, but also recentering ourselves and sort of redefining the next steps politically and collectively. Maybe answer the second question. I don't know. Maybe Marcelle is better for the second question.
Yeah, the second question. I think people are choosing differently, and that's good. That's ideal, because some people want to avoid the Syrian politics altogether, and maybe for a year, maybe for two, maybe they don't want to stare at it at all, and that's by this point that's totally normal. And I think pushing survivors to act as heroes, even outside the country, is harsh. And we don't want to use them for the sake of the cause, because we already used so many of our best activists for the sake of the cause. Like we know that you are at your edge, but go for another speak, for another time, go and expose your deepest trauma to an audience that is not listening ethically, but listening, judging, and coming with propaganda. So to me, I think people are choosing differently. For myself, I feel the best when I'm attached to the cause, because what's inside my mind is close to what I'm living. The other way around, I would be obsessed inside my head while everything around me is normal, as if it has never happened, as what's happening inside my head never happened. But that's me, that's how I function, because to me, that adds meaning to what, like the continuous resistance is giving me meaning. But there's other people who are surrendering to it, is giving them meaning. So what I meant also about healing is how we can live without bitterness with the world. Because the anger we are carrying might make us wish this. We don't want well-being. We don't want human rights. We don't want anything, because we suffered a lot. So these levels of healing Yeah, I know people who are working on the trials that this is what keeps them going. They wake up in the morning asking themselves why we survived, which is, I think, a lot of Syrians ask themselves why we survived. What's so special about us that we survived? And then the answer would be, I survived to do that. But there are so many people who are not. It's like, I survived now and I want to be normal. And I don't want to be attached to this cause. I don't want to be reliving it, because it's not only about the trauma. It's about, am I using it? Am I not respectful to the memory? Am I benefiting from it? Sometimes when I tell people that I'm worried that the book will be successful, they laugh. I'm worried that if the book made me somehow successful, that means the book that I wrote about the people I lost made me. So it is something we are living on every day, in every step. It's like what our success means, what our survival means. So I think these questions and answering it, accepting that there is no one Syrian, we are different in class. I can heal in a way that gives me time to sit and write. That's a privilege. There's people I met in Turkey who are working 16 hours. So even the question of meaning is out of the table. They are working with less than $100 in a factory, 16 hours, and they lost people, and they have meaning question, but they don't have time to ask it. So I think how we help each other to move forward and to find meaning and to keep living, not only surviving, because most of the time we are surviving Bashar al-Assad, then surviving the neighboring countries, then surviving Europe attitude towards Syrian refugees. And we want to move from the surviving phase, because it took a long time now.
Yeah, I would like to add two things on this question, and then to answer Joshka Wessels on what's happening in terms of the judicial procedures in some European countries. I think there is something classical when it comes to the guilty feeling of those who survived and are, making new choices and succeeding in their new lives. When they are committed politically and still connected politically, I think the guilty feeling is a phase that they will all live through, and many will try to, as exactly Marcel was saying, to avoid showing that they are making success out of the misery, let's say, of their own friends and of the cause to which they belong, which I think is really classical in different places. The second thing is that while many Syrians do not want to define themselves only as victims or as victims, there is also this tendency, and one can see it here in the camps in Beirut, can see it in different places, this kind of rivalry between the miserables. I mean, who's more miserable than the other? Even between the Palestinians of Syria and the Palestinians of Lebanon, this happened when it comes to who's more subject to injustice. And I think the Syrian body is still bleeding, so it's quite difficult to overcome that quickly. It will take time, and definitely healing is a necessary process in that. For justice, even if it's still on a symbolic level, and even if it's only targeting officers who are not always decision makers in Syria, but I think there is something starting in Europe, whether in France, where it's not only, small officers. We're talking about Ali Mamlouk. It's also starting in Germany, and there it's much more developed, and I'm sure Joshka knows about it, where you have officers who are not only, in absentia, or who are present in the tribunal, who were part of the torture machine and industry in Syria. There are cases in Sweden, there will be in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Britain. So I think there's something moving, but of course it will take time. And this is very frustrating, because time is frustration when you know that crimes are taking place and took place, and you know the criminals. But of course, the judicial mechanisms do have their own logic and their own mechanisms. But this is a beginning, and I'm sure it will make normalization with the regime much more difficult. It will make business with the regime much more difficult. And this is very important. We need to follow it and to build on it in order to generalize it as a mechanism of ending impunity. It's still at the beginning, but I think there are possibilities more and more to develop it in the future.
Excellent. Well, this will be our last question. And thank you, everyone who's watching, for really terrific and thought-provoking both questions and comments in the comment section. And this last one will be from Friedhelm to end on a positive note. And he said, since you've discussed what went wrong, I was wondering what you think went right. It strikes me that it would be an important to make this part of the narrative and an important part of the narrative.
A lot went right. I like the dignity of saying no to an enemy that high above your power is something no one can steal from you, and I still live by it daily. I met people that protected me, went with me into when I was brave and reckless. They protected me. Just because they believed in a Syria that no one of us should be persecuted by their identity. So all of that went right. There's a lot went right. It's not defined. When I said we need not to define Syrian revolution by its ending, because there is a lot of incredible ethical decisions that happens along the route. In every step, the amount of decisions around the ethics, around what's right for Syria and Syrian people, was guiding a lot of the Syrian politics, especially of the young activists of the revolution who went to the streets in 2011. To me, what went right, I never knew Syria. The Syrian Revolution is my introduction to Syria. I knew Syria of the middle upper Christian class in a small neighborhood. All my friends was alike. We were raised in church, go to the school of the church, and so on. The Syria that I know now, I owe it to the Syrian Revolution. The Syrian Revolution said, this is Syria, and added to it, this is your responsibility. What you gonna do about it? There is class problem. What you gonna do about it? There is sectarian problem. Before that, there is a problem. But to add this, what you gonna do about it? And the citizenship feeling, I think that went right, and I'm proud that it did.
To be honest, I think, and this is why I asked about like the need to historicize, because I mean, some of the most inspiring books about history, like revolutionary history, is the one that talk about its long-term cultural effects, the one that have to do with how like the mentality shifts, how the public culture can entirely changes. And you know, it's only been 10 years or 9 years since 2011. I could tell you, to be honest, as someone who's been living this day in, day out, this notion of, you know, questioning authority, of not taking anything for granted, speaking truth to power, whether it's political power, religious power, economic power, patriarchy. I mean, this is why, you know, like one of my mantras, whenever we talk about comparative Arab Spring studies, I believe that the Syrian Revolution was one of the deepest, most profound, most successful, actually, revolutions, because it went so much beyond just, you know, destabilizing the notion of who should be in power in Damascus and who should, you know, like just talking about, for instance, the gender dynamics and how people relate to religion in the diaspora, for instance, over the past 9 years. This is fascinating, and it will take us years and years to be able to really document it, write about it, you know, beyond impression. Everything has changed and nothing is taken for granted, and nobody is willing to take anything for like anything at face value, and how that is inspiring and sort of redefining not only, you know, the way we interact with each other as individuals, but the way we're also building these diasporic institutions that I talked about. And so each one of these institutions is becoming its own sort of story of how Syrians are redefining what it means to be working, what it means to be interacting with other Syrians. How do you make decisions collectively? How do you respect each other's spaces? How do you talk about, you know, pluralism and democracy and change and difference and all of these, not just in broad theoretical terms about, you know, again, political transition, but how do you embody it in everyday life? This cultural shift, this mental shift, I think is astounding, and I think it will take us many, many years to actually come to grips with its depth and how it's going to change Syrians and future generations.
Yeah, I can add to what Karam and Marcel just said, is that Syria changed many of us forever on the human level. I mean, I cannot remain the same after 2011. There's something that radically changed in the lives of those who followed Syria, who worked on Syria, who had Syrian friends, not to talk, of course, about the Syrians themselves. I was astonished each Friday in 2011, and I was having really difficulty to sleep on Thursday evening, waiting for Friday to know whether they will succeed once again to go to the streets in front of death, of massacres, of torture. Are they going to break once again the wall of fear that was built in Syria? So there was astonishment in front of the Syrian courage, of the determination, of the humor, of the intelligence, of Keframbil, of the slogans, of spontaneity, of solidarity. I think there were lots of things that went right, and one can add to all that the initiatives and the organizations that started, the institutions that were put together by Syrians, the new forms of writing. What Karam mentioned when it comes to this radical aspect of the Syrian Revolution at the beginning is that in addition to all what it did, like many other Arab revolutions did as well, it also worked on dismantling a discourse, an ideology that the Syrian regime imposed and its allies on the Syrians themselves, but also on peoples of the region, on the Lebanese, on the Palestinians, on the Jordanians. So it had many challenges and many tasks, and it did with lots of
Oh, did we go so long without a technical difficulty? Ziad is phoning in from Beirut, and and he's back. Ziad, we'll let you get the last word.
I guess the battery died or something.
Right.
I don't know if I'm back now.
You're back.
Electricity in Beirut. So anyway, electricity, and then it took a few minutes before having. So yeah, I think lots of things went right, and I'm sure that many things will go right in the future. But of course, this will take time and will take lots of serious efforts.
Fantastic. Well, it is an honor to be here with you all and to learn from the tremendously interesting and thought-provoking interventions. So thank you all. I think probably the best way to end is with Elizabeth Kassab's comment. Marcell, Karam, and Ziad, you rock. There's not much to add to that. So thank you all, and thank you to all the organizers of this webinar series. They're all available on YouTube and Facebook and the website to continue to see all of them that have happened this past summer. And we will all, I guess, continue to be in touch. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Bye. Thanks, Yasser, and everyone. Salamat, Karam, Marcel.
Bye-bye, Marcel.